And Ambassador, it's a delight and an honor to have you once again with the Council. Any of you might remember we had him scheduled, I think, for March 3rd, 2022. Something had happened just a week or two before that. We had to do it virtually, but it's wonderful to have you here in person. And you are someone who is, as a young officer, you have served in the U.S. military, you've served in Germany, company commander in Vietnam, huge amount of time with NATO, worked for the United States across Europe, especially the former Soviet states. You know the region, the people very well. You were President Bush's ambassador to Ukraine, President Trump's chargé d'affaires, basically acting ambassador to Ukraine for a large part of 2019. You know the people involved better than anyone. I was chatting with you earlier, you said you've met Zelensky personally 20 or 30 times. Maybe just to get a feeling of where we might be going, an idea of where we've come from, but from their perspectives. First of all, you know Zelensky very well. How do you think he assesses this past year in terms of the war itself and support beyond Ukraine, and I suppose his mindset of these next few weeks?
Ronan, thank you, and thank you for being here. This is a great opportunity. I was here once before, as Ronan says, virtually, so I was probably on one of these screens. So this is much better. This is much better to be in Houston rather than out of Houston. So yes, so President Zelensky, as you mentioned, I did meet him many times while I was there in 2019. He, of course, was elected in the spring of 2019, and I got there in June. He was inaugurated. He had won the election. He ran against the incumbent president. So people remember that President Poroshenko was the president from 2014 through that time when the Russians had invaded in 2014. And Poroshenko was running again. And President Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky at the time, was a businessman, and he was an actor, and he was a comedian, and he was the star of this show, The Servant of the People. So a lot of people knew him, but they knew him as they knew him in his show, Servant of the People. Has anyone seen Servant of the People? A couple of people have. All right, just a quick. You gave me an opportunity.
Yeah, and it's a good story.
This is a great story. This is a great story. So, as I say, he was the CEO of this entertainment company and lead actor and writer. And the story in this TV series, it's a series of episodes. It's had a couple of seasons, and in the first episode, you meet this kind of diminutive high school government teacher. And he's teaching the class. After class, it's set in kind of contemporary Ukraine. So it's right in 2014, 2015. And after class, he gets in conversation with some of the students, really riled up about the problems in Ukraine, in particular the corruption, and in particular the oligarchs. And he's just going on and on. He gets really wound up and cussing and foul mouth, and of course one of the students gets it on film, and sure enough that clip goes viral, as they say, and this high school teacher is elected president. So here he is. And he does a great job because in the series. He takes on the oligarchs, and he takes on the corruption in the government. It's a great thing. So if you ever, it's on Netflix, or at least on Netflix, so you can watch this. But long answer. So President Zelensky, when he then ran for president, and I was telling Ronan that I was there before I even knew I was going to go back out as Chargé in the spring of 2019. I was able to observe the elections. I was there as an election observer. And he won against the incumbent president, as I say, against Poroshenko, 73%. You know, where do you get 73% in a free and fair election? I mean, there's no funny business in this election. The Ukrainians know how to do elections. You know, they've done elections for a long time. It's a real democracy. We'll come back to that. So he ran. President Zelensky ran on, no surprise, cleaning up corruption, but also he ran on ending the war. And the war started in 2014. This is 2019, where he ran, and he was sure that if he could get in a room with President Putin, that he could sit down and they could work things out, and he could end the war on terms favorable to Ukraine. Really idealistic. He never had elected office before, no government service before. I mean, but he was sure he could do this. He was sure he could fight corruption. In fact, when he was talking about corruption, he said, "I'm not going to fight corruption. I'm going to defeat corruption." Is what. But he was sure he could end this war that had been going on since 2014. Well, it was harder than he thought, and he nonetheless was trying very hard. He's very idealistic, very personable. Easy to talk to, and has a charisma, has a spark, has a presence in the room, and we've all seen it now. We've seen him on TV a lot, and last thing I'll say just on this, already too long, Ron. Sorry, but. Who would have known? We talked about having this event on Ukraine that it would be in a day or a week where so much has gone on Ukraine, on ending this war, on phone calls, and we'll talk about this later, but this is a perfect time to have this thing. I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah, and I would say, obviously, in addition to his great charisma and his kind of dynamism, and kind of being an outsider and life imitating art of this TV character who accidentally becomes president, he himself kind of becomes, not accidentally becomes president. But the other incredible thing is his courage, obviously. Plenty of times he could have left the country, would not have to go into the streets of Kiev or other cities that are under threat and attacked. Done that multiple times. How do you think he and his, especially, say, military intelligence leaders assess the last, say, 6 months, especially of the war?
So it's a great question. This gives me an opportunity to put the map up, just to demonstrate the bravery and the courage that you talked about, Ronan. Let me see if I can do this. So on whoops, let me come on back here. So here is, here, sorry.
There's one on that side too, that's easier.
Does this side, maybe this side's better. I don't know if you can see I have to explain the map. It's not obvious of what this is, but this blue area here, so first of all, these are the borders of Ukraine, all the way around. Here's Russia. The blue area up here, and for this, the blue area up around Kiev and Sumy and Kharkiv, that's where the Russians first took. That's part of Ukraine that the Russians took in 2022. The areas outlined in black, Crimea and Donbass, those are the areas that they took in 2014. So in 2022, they invaded big time with 180,000 Russian soldiers. And they took all of that pink area and then all of the blue area all the way to Kiev. And you can see how close they got to Kiev. And this is relevant to Ronan's question. When the tanks were on the outskirts of Kiev, and I know there were assassination squads in Kiev looking for President Zelensky, because what Putin wanted was to take over Ukraine. That was that was his goal. That was his goal. He wanted to take over Ukraine. He wanted to get rid of Zelensky, put his own president in, run the country in that way. And when he sent in all those Russian forces, he surprised everybody. There was a lot of question as to whether he would do it. Our intelligence had pretty good information about he was going to do it. I actually visited President Zelensky in January of 2022, so 3 weeks before the actual invasion, and I had a conversation with him about this, and he was preparing because he had heard from Bill Burns, our CIA chief, who had been there, and told him of our intelligence, saying that the Russians were really getting ready, this is serious. No one wanted to believe it. And President Zelensky told me, he said, you know, the Germans and the French, they're telling me that not to believe this. They're telling me that it's just the Americans being hysterical. And the Russians were saying the same thing. The Russians were saying, invade Ukraine, come on, you guys are that's not serious. We're not. Well, we know what happened. So they invaded, and in the first month, they got to where we're showing in blue. That is right down by the capital. Assassination squads, as I say, in the capital. We thought, and most of the world thought, that there was no way that the Ukrainians were going to defend against the Russians. The Russians major power, major military power. Ukraine had been damaged. This armed force had been damaged by Yanukovych, an earlier president, and no one thought that Ukraine was going to be able to hold out. And they did, of course. But during the time right at the beginning, right in February and March of 2022, we went into President Zelensky and we said, Mr. President, we need you to lead your country. We need you to rally the Ukrainians, all the Ukrainians, to stop the Russians. It's really important that you win. It's really important that you live in order to lead them. So, we said, we will help you survive this first onslaught by taking you, if you want to go, down to the southwestern part of the country, into the Carpathian Mountains, safer, or maybe even into Poland, and a government in exile. We thought that President Zelensky might have to do that. He famously said to the people offering him this, I need ammunition, not a ride. And with that, and we've got some Ukrainians in the room here that will recall, he galvanized the country. He galvanized Ukrainians. He did stay. He stayed in the capital. And he did. He came out 2 or 3 days after they started, took a selfie of himself, a video of himself saying, Yatut, yeah, I'm here. And his team was here. They stayed, and that showed the bravery. He later said that had he left, what would that have said to his soldiers? Yeah. What would that have meant for the soldiers out there fighting, trying against incredible odds to stop the Russians? So, and they did. And again, all that blue area is where the Russians occupied, and then they were pushed out. So that is controlled by Ukrainians right now. One last thing on the map, just while I've got you looking at the map. The part in red is about 20%. It's about 18% of the overall territory of Ukraine. The 1991 borders are what every nation in the world recognizes about Ukraine. 1991 borders, and the Russians now occupy 20% of that 1991 area. And that's in red. That's what you can say. Now, the reason I brought another map here, this map was 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And if you'll notice, the red part, the red part looks the same. And there's a message there. The message is that despite what you hear in a lot of the press, the Ukrainians are holding their own. They're not being overrun. It is true that the Russians, in particular, up until about a month ago, were getting little by little, meter by meter, small village, small crossroads by small crossroads. They were making some progress at great expense on Russian soldiers. The Russians were probably losing 1,000 soldiers a day in that fight. So that's 30,000 a month. That was incredibly, but Putin didn't care. He wanted to grind through. He wanted to keep pushing through on this. So that's the situation then that we're facing here today.
And from Zelensky's point of view, obviously the Ukrainian people has suffered horribly, at least 12,000 civilians killed, probably more. For understandable reasons, the military losses are not released in full, but probably at least 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. On the Russian side, probably, again, they won't say real numbers, but 150,000 killed combined, probably 300,000 injured on all sides, 500,000 people either killed or wounded.
Or more. I mean, those might be
underestimated. And now we have North Koreans, entering the fray as well. From Zelensky's perspective, the Ukrainians have fought incredibly hard, and they are still fighting incredibly hard. But there's a long Russian tradition of going back to the Tsars, go to the Soviet Union, the Stalingrad, and Stalin throughout World War II, of Russian leaders being willing to sacrifice their soldiers, especially, and oftentimes even their own civilians, for a geopolitical gain or what their desire is. How difficult are those just numbers for the Ukrainians when they're fighting incredibly hard, but the Russian population is about 3.5 times larger than Ukraine?
Very hard. It's very hard. So the mobilization that President Zelensky was talking, actually was talking when I was there just before the invasion. He was talking about doubling the size of the army and raising the pay. So he was taking steps, even though he couldn't believe that they were actually going to invade. They did mobilize later on, and they have pulled a lot of soldiers. So every family has faced the loss, one way or the other, some more than one loss. But every family in Ukraine has paid for this. And the Russians, you're right, they have a much larger number of Russians. There are 140 million Russians and probably 30 million or so Ukrainians at this point. A lot of whom have gone into Europe and other places. So the manpower, the soldiers, is a real disparity. Both sides have problems. Mm-hmm. Both sides have this problem. So, and I'm sure we're going to get to it, Ronan, that the current possibility that we're seeing in the last couple of days in these phone calls is welcome. I mean, it's welcomed by Ukrainians. I mean, Ukrainians, no one wants peace more than the Ukrainians. It has to be true. They're tired. They're exhausted. They've been fighting for nearly 3 years. 3 years coming up in a week and a half, in 2 weeks. So that is what is driving this search for some kind of a resolution. But Ukrainians will not give up on their territory. They will not give up on their nation. They will not give in to a big neighbor, the Russians, who Putin has vowed to wipe Ukraine off the map. Ukrainians know that if they don't fight, if they stop fighting, there will not be a Ukraine. There will not be a Ukraine. And Putin has said exactly that. He wants to take Ukraine off the map. He wants it to be Russia. Mm-hmm. So that continues. And the last thing, the motivation of the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian population that supports the soldiers, and the society is fully in support of their soldiers. That motivation is why they've done so well. They've done well for two reasons. One is that strong motivation that the Ukrainians have, knowing that this is literally existential. If they lose, they don't exist. But the second thing is support from the United States and support from Europe. And it's been sometimes slow, sometimes not enough, but it has allowed, with that determination, the Ukrainians to hold off the Russians for 3 years.
Before your long career in the State Department as ambassador rank position with NATO and the former Soviet states in the 90s, and then ambassador in Ukraine, Chargé d'affaires, you started serving the United States many years ago as West Point, platoon leader and company commander in Vietnam and also in West Germany. So you also know the military realities as well. People would say, well, maybe let the Europeans support them, let they give everything to the Ukrainians, why should we do it? What's the reality if the United States especially took away our military support, especially some of the weapon systems that Europeans don't have? What's the stark reality if the U.S. was to cut that off?
The stark reality is the Ukrainians probably could not hold off the Russians more than 6, 8, 9 months. The Ukrainians, however, have been building their own defense industrial base, and a lot of those weapons that you mentioned, Ron, are now being manufactured in Ukraine. A lot of those long-range missiles and long-range drones that are striking deep into Russia at military targets deep in Russia, in particular at oil depots and ammunition depots and drone storage warehouses, those are manufactured in Ukraine. So Ukraine has the ability to continue to supply themselves. But it is true that our support, our weapons, our ammunition, our ability to pull together about 50 nations to help on that military support has been critical. Part of the discussion this week has been the role of the Europeans. And there's a lot of pressure, has been for a long time pressure for the Europeans to do more on this. And this has been part of when I served at NATO back before the Berlin Wall fell. And that was a discussion then and ever since. That is, the Europeans need to share more of the burden. And that's coming to bear right now. And this new proposal, these proposals that are coming out on how this war will end, conceivably this year, has a big role for the Europeans. And I'm pleased to see that the Europeans are actually more than starting, they are stepping up to put together a force. The Brits and the French are talking with others, with the Danes and the Finns, the Baltic states, are talking seriously about putting military forces, in Ukraine, in that 80% of Ukraine that's not red, so the 80% of Ukraine is still under control by Ukraine, and if there is a ceasefire, President Zelensky has said he'd be willing to grudgingly, doesn't want to sit down on this without taking back that red part, that final 18%. But he said he's willing to sit down with one main condition. And that condition is that the United States and Europe give a guarantee that the Russians won't invade again. With that kind of a guarantee, President Zelensky has said he'll sit and talk and maybe not take back that pink part militarily, but take it back like the West Germans finally got East Germany back over time without having to resort to force to get it back. But they need that security guarantee. And the Europeans are beginning now to have that conversation about actually putting forces on the ground in Ukraine after a ceasefire. So that question about Europe is a good one. They don't have the military stocks that we do. They don't have the military defense industrial base that we do. Ours is not in great shape as it is, but it's better than in Europe. But they are stepping up with this idea of a security force.
You mentioned, obviously, any negotiations will be difficult, but for Zelensky, and more importantly, the Ukrainian people, it's a degree of security that they need. And many of them, understandably, probably feel betrayed. 1994, Budapest Memorandum, Russia, the UK and the US, signed agreements that Ukraine would give up at the time, third largest nuclear arsenal in the world.
Correct.
In exchange, Russia would recognize the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine with the idea that they would get support from the West. Obviously, that did not happen at all. Ukraine's in a very difficult position here again. They are not going to be joining NATO for at least many years, a very long, difficult process. President Trump has said for most places, maybe Gaza's different, he doesn't want to deploy the U.S. military unnecessarily abroad. He is unlikely to commit to a direct, say, bilateral defense pact that, say, we would have, say, with South Korea or Japan. And Zelensky would say, it's great to have European support, but without the United States military, it doesn't mean much. The Russians won't be stopped. How do you square that circle?
I think you square that circle, and this is going to be discussed in these talks whenever they start, and it's going to be discussed actually before these talks with the Russians start, because this is not a question for the peace talks. This is not a question for that the Russians get to say anything about. This is the right question. How are the Ukrainians going to be guaranteed that the Russians don't invade again? So we're not talking about peacekeepers here. I mean, this is an important distinction, I think. When people talk about peacekeepers and you think blue helmets and lightly armed and you're monitoring and verifying that the peace is being kept. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a deterrent force here. And then you raise exactly the right question, and the Ukrainians are raising the right question. What is the guarantee that they can count on so that the Russians don't come back? And they also talk about the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum, all Ukrainians know this. Americans don't. But every Ukrainian knows the Budapest Memorandum when they gave up those nuclear weapons in return for a promise that they wouldn't be invaded again. And so they're not going to go for a promise. They're going to demand something else. And your question's a good one. What is the U.S. role in that? I've mentioned already that the Europeans already started to talk about that guarantee and that force that is in there to be sure that the Russians don't come back. But, and you're also right that both the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and President Trump have said that they're not going to send U.S. troops to the ground, to be on the ground in Ukraine. However, what might happen, in answer to your question about how does this circle get squared, what could happen without violating those constraints that they just laid out, we could provide command and control. We could provide intelligence. We could provide targeting assistance. We could provide assistance. We could provide air cover without, again, putting any U.S. forces on the ground. There are things that we provide to NATO forces, and we know how to do this, that don't require us, the United States, to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's possible, and that doesn't violate any commitments or determination that this new administration may have already made about forces. We don't know that yet, but that's certainly an option. That's how you could square that circle.
But for Zelensky, he wants it to be permanent. It's not going to change with a next Democratic or Republican president, or the current president changes his mind. NATO is enshrined in the United States because it was approved, set up by the administration, then passed through Congress. Similar defense alliances like that as well. I think it could be difficult to see something like this getting past Congress even today. How do we actually make it so that Ukraine feels secure and that it's real, that it's not a pledge, it's not a promise, it's that you're duty bound and committed to it?
Ron, you're exactly right. The best guarantee is NATO membership. And you're also right that that's not in the cards right now. The Ukrainians would and are right to expect over time, sometime, that they will be members of NATO. In fact, as they've been told since 2008 that someday they'll be in NATO. And they were told this by NATO heads of state 2 years ago in Vilnius, and then last year in the Washington, D.C. summit. They repeat this all. So the Ukrainians know that that's where they're going to be at some point. It's going to be hard. It's going to take time. But that is going to be the gold standard of the security guarantee. Short of that, what's going to reassure them? I think it's this European force, backed by the United States enablers, as they say, logistics, intelligence, targeting, maybe air cover. I think that is what's going to have to be. And you're right about, you can't, we're in a democracy. We have elections. Elections mean something, and there's new policies that come out. And so, but people recognize that. And at some point when it does come to a vote, because in order to get Ukraine or any other nation into NATO, it's a treaty, which the Budapest Memorandum wasn't. So it was only politically binding, not legally binding. But if Ukraine were to get in NATO, it would have to go to the Senate, Instead, it would have to get 66 votes, and then it would be legally binding. And that's what the Ukrainians would like to see. Short of that, it's kind of NATO light. It's this European force, coalition of willing members of NATO who've worked together with us and with us in the background, kind of this backstopping this European force. I think that's what we got to be shooting for.
I know no one can predict Putin, and that's probably his greatest joys is trying to be always seen as Mr. Unpredictable. It's not a great analogy, but maybe the closest thing we have. This is by far the largest, most deadly war in Europe since World War II. 1938, we think of the Munich Congress, where Hitler basically forced the British and French to come to him to bow down and make peace with him, or I'll do more. Earlier in the year, the Anschluss, he'd taken over control of Austria. He'd taken over Germanic Sudetenland areas of the Czech Republic. Part of his problem in Poland was Danzig, the German areas there. I am protecting and reuniting the Russian people or the German people, whichever way you like to say it. There are large ethnic Russian populations in the Baltics. There are large Russian populations, ethnic populations in parts of Central Asia, other places. Chamberlain at the time, people hailed him and said, we avoided a second world war. Everything's great. Peace in our time. Obviously, a year later, Hitler's September 1st invaded Poland. Do you think this would really stop, I was going to say stop. Do you think this really stop Putin? Or he'll just reconfigure a few years, sell a few $100 billion of oil and gas, and maybe poke around other parts of Georgia or maybe other parts of former territories of the Soviet Union? What do you think?
When you ask East Europeans in particular, when you ask the Poles, when you ask the Latvians and Estonians, when you ask the Finns this question, they know what the Russian imperial instinct is, and they know it's not just Putin. They know that the Russian expansion started 300 years ago. So 300 years, the Russians have been expanding, and the neighbors know it best. So the answer to your question is, we do have to be prepared. We do have to put that force in until they get into NATO, and then that's the right answer for the long term. Because if we don't, then Putin will keep coming. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. And that's why it's so important for Ukraine to win this war or stop them where they are now. With our help, stop them where they are now, and guarantee that that the Russians are not able to come back again. Because unless we do, if it's short of that, if it's not a credible force that the Europeans, backed by the United States, put into Ukraine, they'll be back. There's no doubt.
A bigger, broader question that there's no way to know what decisions President Trump will take or predecessors, who comes after him, either party. But do you think we're at a major inflection point in kind of the global world order that was largely created and strengthened and controlled by the United States, establishing NATO, other defensive agreements, getting Europe back on its feet, getting Japan back on its feet, being an engaged nation? Do you think we're changing now as a country, or maybe even within the Republican Party, where you've served at the highest levels for two different presidents, in terms of prioritizing what we may or may not be willing to do as a country around the world?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good one. There are different views in this new administration as well. There are different views in the country of this. But you're right. Since World War II, there's been an order. There's been an understanding that you don't invade your neighbor. There's been a respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of your neighbors. So neighbors, all nations were sovereign, and until the Russians invaded, it's not true. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and that didn't stand. But in Europe, we didn't have that until the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014. That was a major change. And you're right, now we are facing whether or not that stands and whether or not that is the norm or whether or not that's an aberration. And again, this is why the Ukrainians, Zelensky will say, no one should ever recognize Russian illegal occupation of that part in red on this map. No one should recognize it, because if you do recognize it, if you recognize that, well, yeah, the Russians actually took it and now it's part of Russia, that's the nail in the coffin for that order that kept the peace since World War II. So I think this is a really important time.
Obviously, a lot of different questions. Some of them are similar. I might combine them. One, again, I don't want to go too much into the past, but it is a factor in terms of what's happened and maybe where we go for the future. Someone didn't put the name on it, that's fine. They said, in retrospect, did the U.S. make a mistake in slow playing military assistance to Ukraine? And for the audience to know, a lot of people give Biden administration great credit for sharing intelligence, warning the Ukrainians, getting the Europeans ready, but maybe some of the vital weapon systems were delivered too slow or too late or in too small of a numbers. Do you think that's a factor, and will that be a factor going forward?
Sure it was a factor. As you say, the Biden administration did a lot of good things in terms of assembling this 50-nation coalition, but it was very difficult for the Biden administration to make decisions about the next level of equipment, the next level of weapons, the next level of support, and that delay in making those decisions. And so the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons called javelins. It took a long time to make that decision, but they finally made the right decision, and they went. And then there were these HIMARS, long-range artillery. Again, a lot of hand-wringing and slow decision, but finally they made the right decision. They did that. Abrams tanks, same thing. F-16s, a lot of concern. Oh my gosh, if we set F-16s, isn't this going to escalate? But they finally did, and the F-16s are finally on the battlefield at this point. They're great. These long-range Army tactical missiles, ATACMS, it took a long time for the Biden administration to make that, but they finally made the decision. So my answer is yes, it took too long, and yes, that had an effect on the battlefield. And yes, the Ukrainians could have done more, and there wouldn't be as much red on these maps as there is now, had they made earlier decisions and gotten those weapon systems there earlier. But the Ukrainians would not have been able to stop the Russians without this, slow as it came. And your question is it going to continue? What now the focus is on these negotiations. So we will see how those plays out.
And the idea would be longer term, guarantee and provide those systems in consistent and regular patterns and increments.
I think that's right. I think that even in the case, let's say there is a ceasefire, and let's say there is a European-led and manned, if you will, forces on the ground in that 80% of Ukraine that's not occupied. The Ukrainians are still going to need the weapons and support of the military. I mentioned earlier that they've got their own defense industrial base cranking up as sophisticated. They have more sophisticated drones than anybody in the world, and they are teaching us. The Russians are trying to catch up, and sometimes they do catch up and go in advance. But the Ukrainians have a great but they need that continued support, military support, even after the ceasefire. So that needs to come.
Again, these are, it's hard to know where we'll be even a month from now or a year from now. But in terms of hopefully, if the Ukrainian people, peace can be achieved at some point. Two questions similar. Someone's asked, what are your thoughts on the proposed mineral deal between Ukraine and Trump? Similar to that, Greg asks, should the West get access to these assets, that worth potentially trillions of dollars in Ukraine? And then maybe just in a broader sense, Randolph asks, whenever the war ends, how realistic is the integration of Ukraine into Europe and the European Union?
So on the last question, that's an easier one, and then I'll come back to the minerals. I think Ukraine is on track for the EU. I think getting into the European Union is difficult. It takes a lot of steps. It has taken some countries, 20 years. Some countries are still trying to get in. But the European Union has reached out to Ukraine and has given it a fast track for all the reasons that we just said. It's important for the Ukrainians to win, and part of that winning is integrating into Europe. So I think that's coming. I think that's on track. I think that is going to come out of this peace effort. On the minerals. Yes, there are maybe $26 trillion worth of rare earths and strategic minerals in all of Ukraine. Now, you can see from the map that the Russians have 18% of the territory, and it turns out that some of the deposits of these minerals are in occupied territories. And I've seen estimates that say, somewhere around 60% of the value of the strategic minerals, the minerals that are in Ukraine, 60% could be in occupied areas. 40% of $26 trillion is still a lot of money. And President Zelensky last fall came to Washington and made a proposal that the United States develop that $26 trillion worth of critical minerals. So it was his idea, and he said yes to President Trump's suggestion that there be some kind of a deal where U.S. firms go in and develop those resources. And this is really important, I think, for President Trump to have said this. That would provide the rationale and provide support for continued weapons deliveries from the United States, which is what your earlier question just asked. And some people had questioned whether or not there was going to be continued weapons flow. Because as we know, there are a lot of people who think that's not a good idea. But, so I was very pleased to see President Trump say that with that kind of a deal, for U.S. Helping to develop these critical strategic minerals, that the weapons will continue to flow in return.
I just related to what we were talking about, kind of weapons guarantees or potential even defensive guarantee. Related to that, Jim asked, can you explain why the U.S. would provide such a guarantee, and maybe explain to the audience why, the benefits of it? As you mentioned, that they might not last 6 months without American support, and there isn't a name on this one, but related to it, maybe in terms of especially European troops on the ground in Ukraine. Someone asked, if Russia were to attack a country that with supplied non-NATO troops, would that be considered an attack on NATO? I'm thinking maybe if NATO troops are in Ukraine and they are attacked, that would not necessarily be considered an attack on NATO. How does that work?
This is a great question, and this will have to be part of the rules of engagement of this European-led force in Ukraine. Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed this issue yesterday in Brussels, and he was talking about having the Europeans provide this force. Without being very specific, but that's what he was talking about. And he said there would be no U.S. troops on the ground in that force. Okay, that's what we got. He didn't rule out what I've been talking about, and that is kind of these enablers or the backstopping the United States would do. But the questioner asked the right question: why would we do this? Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the question of how we stop the Russians from continuing to expand as they have done for 300 years, but as they are trying to do now. If there is a force that can be a credible deterrent, and that's what we're talking about. We're not talking, no one wants to see these forces deployed, but you have to be ready if the Russians think about violating the ceasefire and moving back into Ukraine. You have to, in order to stop them, in order to deter them, this is what we're trying to do, you have to have a force that is capable, that is, it's well armed. It's got rules of engagement that say that if the Russians start firing at them, that they can fire back. That's the rules of engagement. And there needs to be that credibility that those actions can be taken. And the Secretary Hegseth said yesterday that the answer to your question, or the question that you asked about Article 5 of the NATO treaty, he said it would not be a NATO mission. So he would. But today he came out. This is why the timing of this discussion is so good. It changes day to day. Yesterday he said some things about what would be on the table, what would not be on the table. Today he came back and said, well, actually, it's up to President Trump. You know, I may have spoken too soon.
Okay.
So that's still an open question.
And you touched upon it before, but maybe just kind of a follow-up to it. Lee asks, you have significant experience in both countries. Is there a case where Russia stops? You know, would that only happen post-Putin? Even if it's not Ukraine, could you see them trying to take more of Georgia down the line, or something else of concern?
So this is a very good question, Lee. President Putin is undoubtedly the single person responsible for this war. However, as I've said earlier, the Russian history, the history of Russia, has been an imperial, autocratic history. So Putin is not alone in this attempt, in this fight. But a lot of people will ask this question: well, what happens when Putin leaves? Sooner or later, he's not going to be there for one reason or another. And then the question is, well, who comes after Putin? Is that person better, worse, the same? Is it chaos? I think what would be the case, we've done some thinking about this, and I think what we concluded was Putin has this obsession with Ukraine. And he probably now realizes, after 3 years of trying to take Ukraine and failing, and being ostracized by the world, and having sanctions put on, and bolstering NATO, NATO, 2 new countries joined NATO because of this war. So this is not a success. He has not won. And other Russians around him will know this. And so it is very possible that the person who comes after Putin, if that's the question that Lee was asking, would be just as bad in terms of oppression of the Russian people, might even be aggressive, but would not have this obsession with Ukraine. Might have less to do with the Ukraine.
Again, it's, I guess, to be determined, but a few people asking about what borders might be negotiated, or would they stay where they are? Frank asked, will Russia be satisfied if Spain was lost, with a land bridge to Crimea? Would they expect a lot more? Robert asks, if Trump has already said the Russians will keep the territory they occupy, how do you go forward to negotiations? And then, in a broader sense, Jonathan asked an interesting question. I sometimes think we have to choose between maintaining post-1945 norms against territorial violations, but also sometimes does that require accepting and dealing with long-term kind of areas that are kind of indeterminate space,
So
Abkhazia and
borders.
Georgia, or in terms of what would be the status of those people who are in say Donbass or in Crimea if that's given to Russia? How do we?
A lot of questions.
Yeah,
Sorry, right. Yeah. So, but let me just make one point. So this is the 2023 map, and you have noticed, we've all seen that the part in red hasn't changed that much to the 2020. Let's see if I go the right word. Nope. Here we are on 20. Jesus. All right. Here we are back. I'm just going to put this down here. Now this is the 2025. This is the current map. There's one difference. There is one difference on this one big difference, and that is right now the Ukrainians occupy part of Russia. Last summer, the Ukrainians attacked Russia and took Russian territory for the first time since, again, World War II, since the Nazis in 42, whatever it was. So so then your question, or the question about territory, is an interesting one in these discussions. What happens to the territories? And President Zelensky has said, okay, we will pull out of Russia, that little teeny place right there near Kursk. We'll pull out of that, but you have to pull out of Donbass and Crimea. Well, that, there were some negotiations there. But the answer to your question, Roland, about what happens to the Ukrainians who live in that area that's shown in red, and including Crimea and Donbass, and this is why the Ukrainians will never give up legal claim, like West Germany, East Germany. They will always hope that they can and guarantee themselves that they will get that back because there are Ukrainians living there, and the Ukrainians know what happens to Ukrainians living under Russian occupation. And it's horrible. Yeah. It's war, it's atrocities, it's torture, it's rape, it's stealing of children, it's kidnapping of children taken back into Russia.
Massive man-made famine killing 2 million, 3 million
in the 30s. There's a Holodomor, that's exactly right. But on this war, Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war criminal for that last reason, that is stealing the children, kidnapping children, Ukrainian children taken back into Russia. So this is why Ukrainians feel so strongly about those territories. Yes, it's territory, and and the world order issues that you talked about earlier, that's important. But for the Ukrainians to say it's not just land, it's people, it's Ukrainians that are living there that we care about. So that's what they will do. It's a good question, though, about if the ceasefire is agreed at some point, then there will have to be some expectation of treatment of people in these territories, and there'll have to be some enforcement of that.
A lot of great questions here. Thank you so much, Ambassador. We could be here for hours. It'll be excellent and informative and entertaining. But I'm sorry, maybe these two combined, and one last good question from the audience. VJ asks, obviously, again, if it's predictive, what is your most likely scenario as well as your kind of worst case scenario? And related to that, Dale asks, if a peace, some form of peace is able to be put in place, what do you see as the probability that it would hold over the next 4 or 5 years?
So best case, worst case, and how durable. Best case is that President Trump uses the strong leverage that he has over Putin. And President Trump has indicated he knows he's got that leverage. He knows that the Russian economy is in bad shape. And he knows that Putin would like to be out of this war. So best case, if President Trump uses that leverage, continues to provide the weapons to the Ukrainians to enable them to stop this grinding advance, slow, grinding, expensive advance that the Russians are able to do today, and stops that, and then recognizes that the ultimate security guarantee is NATO. That's the best case. That's the best case. And this gets maybe to the longer term question. When Ukraine succeeds, under this scenario, the Russians temporarily control the occupied territories that is in red that we've got here. That's a temporary occupation. Like East Germany, West Germany, the West Germans got back East Germany, and again, in the best case, the Ukrainians succeed so well, they develop their economy so well, they join the European, have European standards, so attractive that they win back these occupied territories. That's the best case. Worst case is if we are outsmarted, if we are outmaneuvered, if Putin somehow gets what he wants, and if Putin comes out, it seemed to be coming out a winner. And he can say, look, I invaded and I got away with it. And I killed all those civilians and I got away with it. And no one's holding me accountable. That's the worst case.
And just a little bit of follow-up on that, and then a good question to finish with the audience. It's early. We don't know the details. We know Trump and Putin spoke this week. Fortunately, Zelensky himself wasn't even aware of it until after it happened. We've heard about what Trump was supposedly willing to concede to Russia, keep the territory you've conquered, no NATO, long term, we'll make this work out. But I haven't heard yet what concessions has Putin made. What was it that he gave up?
That's the right question. That's exactly the right question, Ron. I think what Secretary Hicks has said today was, those things that we thought we were talking about here, that, no NATO, keep the occupied territories. The Secretary said, actually, that's up to the negotiators, and in particular up to President Trump. So we're not conceding that yet. I think that's important. The other thing, by the way, that President Trump has said today, someone asked him, we didn't actually hear that Ukraine, to your question, was going to be in these negotiations. And President Trump was very clear today. Absolutely, they're going to be in Ukraine. Of course, they're going to be in Ukraine, in these negotiations. Ukraine's going to be there. So that was reassuring, and I think that's, of course, the right answer.
And before this is last question, the other major power we have to contend with, much bigger, much longer term, bigger threat, economically a powerhouse. We're having something on China next week. You might have heard of Jimmy Lai before, probably the most famous now Chinese political prisoner and dissident for many, many years. We're hosting his longtime friend and colleague, Mark Clifford, who's worked for him many years, who's the editor in Hong Kong, the largest speaking English language newspaper in East Asia. That'll be next week on the 19th. And then actually related to Ukraine again, but kind of from a different perspective. Any of you might know Frank Langfitt from NPR. So he was NPR's UK correspondent for the last 8 years. He came back last year. He's worked all over the world, but while he was based in the UK, he spent a huge amount of time, especially 2022, 23, 24, back and forth covering what's happening in Ukraine. So he'll be talking about it, say, from the UK's perspective beyond, but another good source on Ukraine. And I just want to ask, this is a good question from Michael. You had earlier mentioned why this is important, should be seen as important to the American people and to our country. But in terms of carrying that forward, Michael asks, in light of this week's events and announcements, how can we, as ordinary Americans, influence this administration or any politician, Democrat or Republican, to strongly support Ukraine, democracy, and independence? So
this is a really important question, and I'm so glad that people are interested in this issue. I'm glad you're having a conversation about this, Lauren. I think this is really important. And people listen. Congress listens. When they're hearing from people in this room and people more broadly, they hear that's important to their constituents that they win. You can also make contributions. There are a lot of ways to help out the Ukrainians. But in terms of what we are going to be able to do, what the Americans are going to be able to do, we need to demonstrate that we have a commitment to this, to some order, to some accountability, that we have some impression that we can do something about that, we can have an effect, we can express our support for the stopping the war. That's important, but it's got to be a lasting, durable peace. It's got to be a just peace. It cannot be just a peace that stops the fighting and then allows it to happen again. It's got to be a just, lasting, and durable peace.
And related to that, I will volunteer two good friends of the council, Consul General Tarasuk and Consul Protsak. Can you mind standing up? Paolo and Vitali, working incredibly hard, Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. Every single day, I've known you guys for the last 3 years, multiple events to try and gain support for Ukraine, whether economic support, business transactions, getting people to know about things. If you're interested, there is a bipartisan rally this Monday, the 3rd anniversary of this horrific war. That'll be held in front of City Hall, so that will be with people from the administration of City Hall itself. Typically, there are both Republican and Democratic, oftentimes Congress men and women involved in different rallies. But basically, if you just want to show your support to the Ukrainian people,
We talk about showing to American politicians what we think. That's a great place to do. It's at 5 o'clock. If you guys have any more questions, you can ask them afterwards. And thank you both very much for all that you do. And lastly, not just for the last years in Ukraine, but Ambassador Taylor, it's an honor and pleasure for us to host you again here. And thank you for serving basically your entire life in the United States. As a young infantry officer in Vietnam and then Germany, years with NATO, State Department, all over Europe, in Kiev and back again. Thank you for all you've done for the country, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.